Every January, the most powerful people on Earth gather in a small Swiss town for the World Economic Forum. Presidents, billionaires, prime ministers. They meet in buildings where, a century ago, patients lay dying on open-air porches wrapped in blankets, gasping for breath in the thin mountain air. Davos, the town that tuberculosis built. Welcome to the Sanatorium. Tonight, we're travelling to the Swiss Alps, to a valley nearly a mile above sea level, where the air is thin and cold and supposedly miraculous. A place where thousands of people came to fight for their lives, breathing the mountain air that doctors believed could heal what no medicine could cure. A place that transformed from a quiet farming village into one of the most famous destinations in the world, all because of a single disease. If you're new here, this channel explores how tuberculosis, the disease that killed 1 in 4 people in the 19th century, shaped everything from architecture to art, from fashion to the American West. It is a disease that changed the way we build buildings, the way we think about health, the way we imagine what it means to be sick. If that sounds like your kind of history, consider subscribing. There are many more stories to tell, stories of patients and doctors, of scientists and artists, of desperate hope and remarkable transformation. Now, settle in, find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, perhaps pull a blanket closer the way the tuberculosis patients once did on those famous cure terraces. We have a long journey ahead, through snow-covered peaks and grand sanatoriums, through the pages of one of literature's greatest novels, through the remarkable transformation of a town that learned to turn death into an industry, and then transformed again when the industry collapsed. Let's begin. Imagine, if you will, a valley in the Swiss Alps. It is the year 1853, and you have travelled for days to reach this place. From Zurich, you took what roads existed, climbing through forests and across streams, always upward, always toward the peaks that seemed to float above the world like islands in the sky. The final leg of your journey was on foot, or perhaps by mule, climbing steep paths that wind through forests of pine and spruce. The trees grow smaller as you ascend, stunted by the altitude. The meadows give way to rock and snow, and all the while, the air grows thinner with every step. Your breath comes harder, your heart beats faster, labouring to supply oxygen to your body in this rarefied atmosphere. But something else happens too, something you notice almost without realising it. Time, twos. The air tastes different here, cleaner somehow, sharper, cold as spring water even in summer. There is a clarity to it, a purity that you have never experienced in the crowded cities of the lowlands. Each breath seems to fill your lungs more completely than any breath you have taken before. The village that greets you is modest, a few hundred souls perhaps, farmers mostly, and their families. They have lived in this valley for generations, their ancestors having climbed these same paths centuries ago, seeking refuge from wars and plagues and the turmoil of the flatlands. Their lives are hard, alpine winters that last half the year, summers too brief for bountiful harvests. The growing season is short, the cold is relentless, isolation is complete. In winter the passes are blocked by snow, and the village is cut off from the world below. The wooden chalets cluster together as if for warmth, their roofs steeply pitched to shed the heavy snow that can accumulate to depths measured in meters. Smoke rises from chimneys, wood fires burning to keep the cold at bay. This is Davos, and in 1853, no one outside these mountains has any reason to have heard of it. It is not on any major trade routes. It produces nothing of particular value to the outside world. It is simply a village. one of hundreds scattered through the Alps, where hardy people live hard lives and the modern world seems impossibly far away. But a young doctor has just arrived. His name is Alexander Spengler, and he has come here not by choice but by necessity, a political refugee fleeing the failed revolutions that have swept through Germany in 1848. He had been a student of law in Mannheim, caught up in the revolutionary fervour of that hopeful doomed year. When the revolutions failed, when the old order reasserted itself, many of his fellow revolutionaries were imprisoned or executed. Spengler fled across the border to Switzerland, where he started over. He is trained in medicine at the University of Zurich, a second career for a man whose first career was destroyed by politics. And he has accepted a position as the rural physician for this remote community, a job that no one else wanted, in a place that no one else would choose. What Dr. Spengler will observe in this village will change not only Davos, but the entire world's understanding of how to fight the deadliest disease of the age. He will notice something peculiar, something hiding in plain sight, something that his colleagues in the great medical centres of Europe had never thought to look for because they had never visited a place like this. The villagers of Davos do not get tuberculosis. To understand why this observation was so remarkable, we must first understand what tuberculosis meant in the 19th century. It was, quite simply, the greatest killer of the age. In cities across Europe and America, tuberculosis, also called consumption, or the White Plague, was everywhere. In some urban centres, 1 in every 7 deaths was caused by tuberculosis. In others, the proportion was even higher. Entire families would be wiped out, one member after another succumbing to the disease. The wealthy died, the poor died, the young and talented seemed to die with particular cruelty, their lives cut short just as they were beginning to flourish. The disease progressed slowly, which made it all the more terrible. A patient might linger for months or years, gradually wasting away. The cough would grow worse, the fevers would come and go, weight would fall away, leaving skeletal figures who had once been robust. And then, eventually, the hemorrhage, the blood coughed up from destroyed lungs, would signal the final act. Tuberculosis had many names. Consumption, because it seemed to consume its victims from within. The White Plague, because of the pallor it brought to the skin. Phthisis, the old Greek term, the captain of all these men of death, as one writer called it. The disease struck indiscriminately. It killed in the slums, where crowded conditions and poor nutrition created perfect breeding grounds for contagion. But it also killed in wealthy drawing rooms, in artists' studios, in the chambers of royalty. John Keats died of tuberculosis at 25, Frédéric Chopin at 39, the Brontë sisters, Franz Kafka. The list of writers and artists and musicians claimed by the disease reads like a who's who of 19th century culture. The cause of tuberculosis was unknown. Some believed it was hereditary, a weakness in the blood that passed from parent to child. If your mother had died of consumption, the thinking went, you carried that weakness within you. Others thought it was caused by unhealthy passions, by artistic temperament, by the stresses of modern life. There was even a romantic mythology around the disease. Consumption was associated with sensitivity, with creativity, with a burning inner fire that consumed the body even as it fueled artistic genius. Pale skin and flushed cheeks, symptoms of the disease, became fashionable. Young women powdered their faces white and rouged their cheeks in imitation of the consumptive look. The idea that tuberculosis might be contagious, that it might be caused by something as mundane as a germ, would not be proven until 1882, when Robert Koch would announce his discovery of the tuberculosis bacillus. Even then, many doctors resisted the idea. They had built their practices and their theories around heredity and constitution. They did not want to believe that their patients were spreading the disease with every cough. Without knowing the cause, doctors had little to offer their patients. Rest was recommended, good food, fresh air. But in the crowded, polluted cities of the Industrial Revolution, fresh air was in short supply. The factory smoke hung over the tenements. Whole families crowded into single rooms. Windows were kept closed against the cold. The conditions that allowed tuberculosis to spread were everywhere. And so Dr. Alexander Spengler arrived in Davos, a refugee who had traded the revolutionary fervour of Mannheim for the quiet isolation of an alpine village. He had studied medicine at the University of Zurich, but his original training had been in law. It was only after the failed revolution of 1848, when many who had participated were imprisoned or exiled, that he turned to medicine as a new career. Perhaps this background in law helped him. Lawyers are trained to notice patterns, to gather evidence, to build cases from observation. And almost immediately after arriving in Davos, Dr. Spengler noticed something that his colleagues in the lowlands would have found astonishing. The villagers were healthy. Not just healthy, remarkably, robustly healthy. Despite their hard lives, despite the harsh winters, despite the limited diet and primitive conditions, tuberculosis was virtually unknown among them. Dr. Spengler, who had seen the disease claim so many lives in the lowlands, found himself treating farmers for broken bones and childhood fevers and the ordinary complaints of rural life. He asked the villagers about their family histories. He examined their chests. He listened for the telltale sounds of lungs compromised by disease. He found nothing. But tuberculosis, never. The contrast was stark. In the cities he had left behind, tuberculosis was everywhere. In Zurich, in Mannheim, in every crowded urban centre, the disease claimed its victims by the thousands. But here, in this remote valley, in this village so isolated that news from the lowlands might take weeks to arrive, nothing. This observation would consume Dr. Spengler's thinking for years. Why should this remote alpine valley be spared the scourge that was decimating the cities below? What was different about Davos? He considered various theories. Perhaps it was genetic. Perhaps the people of Davos had some hereditary resistance to the disease. But when he traced family histories, he found no evidence of this. Some villagers had moved to Davos from the lowlands. They seemed equally protected. Perhaps it was diet. The villagers ate well, at least by their own standards. Fresh milk and cheese, meat from there, livestock, vegetables from their gardens in the brief summer months. But this diet was not so different from what people ate in healthy rural areas of the lowlands, where tuberculosis still struck. The answer, he came to believe, was the air itself. At an altitude of more than 1,500 metres, or nearly a mile above sea level, the air in Davos was unlike anything in the lowlands. It was dry. It was cold. It was, Spengler theorised, somehow purifying. The intense alpine sunshine, the lack of humidity, the absence of the miasmas and pollutants that hung over industrial cities, all of these factors combined to create an environment in which the consumption simply could not thrive. The theory made a certain intuitive sense. Everyone knew that tuberculosis flourished in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Everyone knew that fresh air seemed to help patients feel better, at least temporarily. What if the air of Davos was simply the freshest, cleanest air available? Fresh air concentrated and purified to an extreme degree. If this was true, Dr. Spengler reasoned, then perhaps the answer to tuberculosis was not to be found in medicine at all. Perhaps the answer was geography. Perhaps the cure was the mountain itself. It was a revolutionary idea. It was also, as we now know, largely wrong. the mountain could not cure tuberculosis, which was caused by bacteria that no amount of fresh air could kill. But it was wrong in a productive way. It was wrong in a way that would save lives and transform a village and shape the course of medical history. It would transform a remote farming village into one of the most famous destinations on Earth. Dr. Spengler's theory remained just that, a theory, until he began to test it. In the early 1860s, he started recommending that tuberculosis patients from the lowlands travel to Davos for treatment. The journey alone was an ordeal. From Zurich, travellers would take a train as far as the rail lines extended, then transfer to a horse-drawn carriage for the steep, winding climb into the mountains. The final approach to Davos could take an entire day. Hours of bumping along rutted mountain roads, the air growing thinner with every switchback, the temperature dropping as the altitude increased. For patients already weakened by tuberculosis, this journey was exhausting. Some arrived barely able to stand. Others had to be carried from the carriage to their rooms. A few died on the way. But those who survived the journey faced something unexpected. They faced hope. The treatment itself was almost absurdly simple. Patients were to rest. They were to spend long hours outdoors wrapped in blankets, breathing the mountain air. They were to eat well, rich foods, plenty, of milk from the Alpine cows, fresh butter and cheese from the Alpine meadows, and a glass or two of Veltliner wine with their meals. They were to sleep in rooms with windows thrown open to the cold mountain night. The daily routine was precise. Patients would rise early, take a light breakfast, then proceed to the cure terrace for their morning rest period. They would lie perfectly still, breathing deeply, watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks. Conversation was discouraged. The lungs needed rest as much as the body. At midday, there would be a substantial meal, meat, vegetables, rich sauces, all designed to build strength in bodies that had been wasting away. The Victorian belief was that tuberculosis consumed the body from within, and that the cure required rebuilding what had been lost. Patients who had arrived skeletal were encouraged to gain weight, to eat until they could eat no more. The afternoon brought another rest period, and then, as evening approached, a light supper. Patients retired early. Sleep was considered essential to recovery. That was it. No medicines, no surgeries, just rest, food, and air. To modern ears, this sounds like barely a treatment at all. But we must remember that in the 1860s there was no effective treatment for tuberculosis. Patients were dying by the tens of thousands, and doctors had nothing to offer them but platitudes and morphine to ease their final hours. Dr. Spengler's patients, by contrast, sometimes got better. Not all of them, not even most of them perhaps, but some patients who arrived in Davos expecting to die found themselves over months of rest and mountain air slowly regaining their strength. Their fevers subsided, their coughs lessened, the blood that had flecked their handkerchiefs grew less frequent, then stopped altogether. Word began to spread. Slowly at first, through medical journals and professional correspondence, then faster, as doctors told their patients, and patients told their families, and the network of information expanded outward from this alpine valley. There was a doctor in the Alps, they said, a German refugee. He had discovered something remarkable. His patients were improving, some were even recovering, actually recovering from tuberculosis, the disease that everyone knew was incurable. In 1860, the first guest house specifically for tuberculosis patients opened in Davos. It was a modest establishment, nothing like the grand sanatoriums that would come later, but it represented something new. It was the beginning of what would become a global industry. Patients began to arrive from the lowlands. They came by carriage and on foot, making the long climb into the mountains, hoping that the air that had protected the villagers might also protect them. They came with their families, they came alone, they came expecting to die, and hoping desperately that they might not. In 1865, the first winter guests arrived. Until then, Davos had been a summer destination only. No one imagined that patients could survive, let alone benefit from, the brutal alpine winters. The conventional wisdom held that cold air was dangerous for consumptives, that they should be kept warm, sheltered from drafts, protected from the elements. But Dr. Friedrich Unger and Hugo Richter from Germany came in February of that year, determined to test the opposite theory. They underwent treatment on a bed made from a hay sledge covered with boards, essentially sleeping outdoors on a modified farm implement surrounded by snow. Imagine the scene. 2 men, already weakened by disease, lying motionless on wooden platforms as the temperature dropped below freezing, their breath visible in the air, frost forming on their blankets, the stars wheeling overhead, impossibly bright in the thin atmosphere. It must have seemed like madness. But they did not die. They improved. The news that tuberculosis patients could be treated in winter, that the cold alpine air might actually be more beneficial than the milder seasons, was revolutionary. It contradicted everything the medical establishment believed about respiratory disease. The logic, as Dr. Spengler and his followers understood it, went something like this. The tuberculosis bacillus thrived in warm, moist environments. The hot, humid air of the lowlands provided ideal conditions for the disease to spread and multiply. But the cold, dry air of the alpine winter was hostile to the bacteria. By exposing patients to this environment, the body's natural defences were given a fighting chance. We know now that this explanation was incomplete. The true advantage of the alpine cure lay partly in the isolation it provided. Tuberculosis patients, gathered in sanatoriums far from crowded cities, were less likely to spread the disease to others and less likely to be reinfected themselves. The rest and good nutrition allowed some patients' immune systems to successfully contain the infection, walling it off in calcified nodules that could remain dormant for decades. But in the 1860s, no one knew about bacteria or immune responses. What they knew was that some patients who came to Davos in winter got better. That was enough. It meant that Davos was not just a summer retreat but a year-round destination, and it meant that the stream of patients seeking the cure would never have to stop. Dr. Spengler was a physician, not a businessman. But he was about to meet someone who was. Willem Jan Holsboer was a Dutchman, born in 1834 in Zutphen in the Netherlands, the son of a cotton manufacturer who also served as mayor. Holsboer had travelled to Davos for the same reason so many others did. His wife was sick. She had tuberculosis, and the mountain cure represented her best hope for survival. Holsboer's wife did not survive. Many patients came to Davos to die. The mountain air offered hope, not certainty. But something unexpected happened to Holsboer himself. Rather than return to the Netherlands after his wife's death, he stayed. He saw something in this small alpine village that others had missed. He saw opportunity. Where others saw only snow and sick people, Holsboer saw the makings of an industry. Tuberculosis was everywhere. The wealthy were desperate for any treatment that offered hope. And Davos had something unique, a reputation, building year by year as a place where the dying sometimes lived. In 1868, Holsboer and Dr. Spengler joined forces. Together they founded the Kranstalt Spengler-Holsboer, the Spengler-Holsboer Sanatorium. It was one of the first purpose-built facilities for tuberculosis treatment in the Alps, and it would become the model for dozens more to come. The sanatorium was not just a medical facility. It was a complete environment for living with illness. There were dining rooms where patients could take their meals together, maintaining the social rituals of civilized life even as they battled for survival. There were reading rooms and music rooms, spaces for conversation and quiet contemplation. There were gardens where patients could stroll during the warmer months, and heated interior corridors for the depths of winter. And of course there were the cure terraces, long balconies where rows of reclining chairs faced the mountains, where patients would lie for hours at a time, wrapped in blankets, breathing the air that was supposed to save them. But Holzboe's vision extended far beyond a single sanatorium. He was a businessman, not a physician, and he thought in terms of systems and infrastructure. He understood that for Davos to truly flourish as a health resort, it needed more than good air and dedicated doctors. It needed hotels, it needed banks, it needed shops and restaurants and all the amenities that wealthy invalids would expect. Above all, it needed a way to get there. In 1888, Holzboe proposed something that many considered impossible, a railway line from Landquart in the lowlands up to Davos. The terrain was forbidding, steep mountain passes, deep valleys, rivers that flooded in spring. A standard gauge railway, the kind that connected the great cities of Europe, was out of the question. But a narrow gauge line might work. On the 29th of June, 1888, a groundbreaking ceremony was held. Local dignitaries gathered. Speeches were made about progress and prosperity. Few could have imagined what the railway would bring. The construction took 2 years. Workers blasted through rock, bridged gorges, and laid track through some of the most challenging terrain in Europe. The narrow gauge locomotives would have to climb gradients that would defeat ordinary trains, navigating curves so tight that the front and rear of the train could sometimes see each other. And in 1890, the first train pulled into Davos. The railway changed everything. A journey that once took days could now be completed in hours. Patients who might have died on the road could arrive fresh enough to begin their treatment immediately. Families could visit their ailing relatives. Supplies could flow in, news could flow out. Holzboe would rename his company the Rheitische Bahn, the Rhaetian Railway, reflecting his ambition to extend the network throughout the region. He founded the Bank of Davos to finance further development. He established an electrical power company to bring modern conveniences to the growing town. The railway exists to this day. Tourists and business travellers take it without thinking about its origins, about the sick and dying people whose need to reach the mountain justified its existence. The transformation of Davos was astonishing. Within a generation, the village went from a few hundred farmers scratching a living from the alpine land to a boomtown of hotels, sanatoriums and villas. Grand buildings rose where cattle had once grazed. Restaurants and shops catered to an international clientele. By the early 1900s, the town was recording 700,000 overnight stays per year. 700,000 in a place that, 50 years earlier, had been so remote that most Swiss people had never heard of it. All because of tuberculosis. All because of the air. As the sanatoriums multiplied, a distinctive architecture began to emerge, one that would eventually influence building design far beyond the Swiss Alps. The logic was simple. If mountain air was the cure, then patients needed maximum exposure to that air. Buildings were designed not as protective barriers against the elements, but as frameworks for delivering the healing atmosphere directly to the sick. This was a radical departure from traditional architectural thinking. For centuries, buildings had been conceived as shelters, as barriers between the fragile human body and the hostile forces of nature. Walls were thick, windows were small. The interior was a refuge from the outside world. But the sanatorium architects turned this logic on its head. For tuberculosis patients, the outside world was not hostile, it was healing. The enemy was not the cold mountain air, but the stuffy, overheated interiors of conventional buildings. The goal of architecture was not to exclude the environment, but to embrace it. The most distinctive feature was the cure terrace. Broad balconies or porches where patients could recline for hours at a time, wrapped in blankets, breathing the cold mountain air. These terraces faced south, maximising exposure to the alpine sunshine, which was also believed to have healing properties. The patients would lie in neat rows, their reclining chairs positioned to catch the most sunlight. From a distance, it must have looked like a strange kind of worship. Rows of figures facing the sun, motionless, silent, breathing deeply of the thin mountain air. Inside the sanatoriums, large windows flooded the rooms with light. The traditional steeply pitched chalet roof, designed to shed heavy alpine snow, gave way to something new, the Davos flat roof. These flat roofs, slightly angled toward the centre to drain snowmelt through internal gutters, created additional space for rooftop terraces. The flat roof was a technical challenge in the alpine climate. Snow could accumulate to tremendous depths. Traditional roofs solved this problem by shedding snow before it could cause damage. The flat roof required a different solution. The slightly angled surface channeled snowmelt to interior drains, which carried it away through heated pipes that prevented freezing. The architects Otto Flieghardt and Max Hefele, based in Zurich, became the master builders of this new architectural form. Their Queen Alexandra Sanatorium, designed from 1905 onward, exemplified the philosophy. The building was conceived not as a protective shell, but as a machine for inhabiting the atmosphere. Walls seemed almost secondary. The real architecture was the mountain air itself. The building existed to organize space, to position patients correctly in relation to the sun and the breeze. It was architecture in service of medicine, form following function, with an intensity that would later become the hallmark of modernist design. One innovation was the Lieghalle, the lying hall or rest hut. These were small revolving shelters, designed by Dr. Karl Turban, just large enough to accommodate 1 or 2 beds. Patients could be wheeled inside, and the entire structure could be rotated to follow the sun or to shield against the wind. The rotating mechanism was ingenious. A patient could be positioned to catch the morning sun as it rose over the eastern peaks, then gradually turn to follow the light across the sky when the wind shifted, as alpine winds often do. The shelter could be repositioned for protection. The patient never had to move, the building moved around them. These shelters reduced architecture to its most elementary purpose, creating a space for a human body to exist in specific relationship to the environment. There were no unnecessary ornaments, no social pretensions, just a roof, walls that could be opened or closed, and a mechanism for reorientation. By 1900, many of these shelters had been installed in the grounds of the larger sanatoriums. Patients would spend entire days in them, sometimes sleeping outdoors even in winter, wrapped in wool and fur, their breath visible in the freezing air. It is a striking thought that people who were desperately ill, whose lungs were compromised by disease, would voluntarily expose themselves to sub-zero temperatures in the belief that the cold would heal them. The physicians documented everything. Temperature readings were taken multiple times daily, not just of the patient's bodies but of the air itself. Humidity was measured, wind direction was noted, the angle of the sun was calculated, everything was recorded in meticulous case files, as if by accumulating enough data the secret of the cure might finally be revealed. Patients learned to speak a specialized vocabulary. They discussed their morning temperatures and afternoon readings. They compared coughs and noted hemorrhages. They knew the names of the different winds and could predict weather changes by the way their symptoms responded. But we must remember that there were no alternatives, no antibiotics, no effective medicines of any kind. The mountain air was all they had. And so they lay on their cure terraces, these desperate people, breathing the cold air, watching the sun move across the sky, measuring their temperatures, recording their symptoms. They built lives in the shadow of death. They formed communities of the sick. They created an entire culture of illness, with its own rituals and its own vocabulary, and its own strange mixture of hope and resignation. Some recovered, many did not, but the sanatorium gave them structure, gave them purpose, gave them something to do while they waited to learn their fate. It gave them, in a word, hope, and hope, even when unfounded, has value. Dr. Alexander Spengler died in 1901, having lived nearly half a century in the village he had helped transform. He arrived as a refugee with nothing. He departed as a pioneer, his name synonymous with the Alpine cure. He had seen the population of Davos multiply many times over. He had seen the first guest houses give way to grand sanatoriums. He had seen the railway arrive, bringing patients by the thousands. He had seen his theory that mountain air could cure tuberculosis, accepted as medical orthodoxy across Europe. Whether he ever doubted that theory, we do not know. Whether he ever wondered if the patients who recovered might have recovered anyway, or if the patients who died might have been saved by some treatment not yet discovered, these questions are lost to history. What remains is the legacy. A town transformed, an industry created, an idea that shaped medicine for nearly a century. But the Spengler name would continue to shape Davos long after his death. His son, Dr. Carl Spengler, inherited both his father's medical practice and his devotion to the Alpine town. Carl Spengler had grown up in the sanatorium world. He had watched the sick arrive by train, had seen them wheeled onto cure terraces, had observed the slow rituals of the mountain cure. He knew better than most what tuberculosis meant, the fear and the hope, the long waiting, the uncertain outcomes. He was also an enthusiastic supporter of the local ice hockey club HC Davos, which was founded in 1921. Ice hockey had come to Davos along with the international community of sanatorium patients. Young men who were well enough to exercise but not well enough to return home had taken up the sport during their long convalescence. And in 1923, Carl Spengler had an idea that would create one of the most enduring sports traditions in the world. The First World War had ended just 5 years earlier, and Europe remained bitterly divided. Nations that had been enemies still viewed each other with suspicion. The wounds of the war, the millions dead, the empires collapsed, the old order destroyed, were still raw. Carl Spengler believed that sport could help bridge these divides. He had seen, in his father's sanatoriums, how illness could unite people who might otherwise have been enemies. German and French, English and Russian, they had all come to Davos seeking the cure, and they had found themselves lying side by side on the cure terraces sharing their hopes and fears. If disease could unite enemies, why not sport? He donated a trophy, a challenge cup, and invited ice hockey teams from across Europe to compete in Davos during the Christmas holiday. His explicit intention, stated in the original charter, was to give the once hostile nations an opportunity to rediscover mutual understanding and trust through fair and friendly competition, and to extend a hand of camaraderie. It was an idealistic vision, perhaps naive, but it worked. Teams came from countries that had been at war with each other just years before. They competed fiercely on the ice, but they met peacefully off it. The tournament became a symbol of reconciliation. The first Spengler Cup was won by the Oxford University Ice Hockey Club, a team composed largely of Canadians studying at Oxford. In the early years, HC Davos and the Czechoslovak team LTC Prague dominated the competition, each winning 7 titles. The tournament was played outdoors on an alpine rink until 1978. Players competed in the freezing air, their breath visible, the mountains looming above them. It must have been a spectacular sight. The bright uniforms against the white snow, the clatter of sticks on ice, the roar of the crowd echoing off the peaks. The tournament continues to this day, now the oldest invitational ice hockey tournament in the world and the second largest sporting event in Switzerland. Team Canada has dominated in recent decades, winning 16 times since 1984. But the original spirit endures, international competition as a path to international understanding. It is a fitting legacy for the Spengler family, a tournament born from the conviction that even enemies could find common ground in the thin mountain air. The same conviction, in a sense, that had driven Alexander Spengler to build his sanatoriums, the belief that something about this place could heal what seemed unhealable. As Davos's reputation spread, it began to attract not just the wealthy sick, but the famous sick. Writers and artists, politicians and nobility all made their pilgrimages to the mountain, seeking the cure that conventional medicine could not provide. One of the earliest and most celebrated visitors was Robert Louis Stevenson. In November of 1880, the Scottish author arrived in Davos with his American wife Fanny and her son Lloyd. Stevenson was 30 years old and had been battling lung disease for most of his adult life. His doctors had recommended the Alpine cure, and so he found himself, as winter descended on the Alps, checking into the Hotel Belvedere. Stevenson would spend 2 winters in Davos, and he hated it. The confinement drove him nearly mad. Here was a man who had roamed the Cevennes with a donkey, who would eventually sail the South Pacific and settle among the people of Samoa. The Hotel Belvedere, however comfortable, was a prison. The cure terraces were cells. The endless routine of rest and measurement and rest again was torture for a restless spirit. In his essays, he described the health resort as a claustrophobic trap. He compared the desolate alpine wilderness to Lapland, Labrador and Alaska. He wrote bitterly of patients condemned to death by gradual dry rot, or else drowning in their own blood during hemorrhages. His letters from this period are filled with longing for escape. He dreams of warmer climates, of adventure, of anywhere but this beautiful, suffocating valley. And yet he remains, because the alternative, the crowded, smoky cities where his lungs would surely fail, is worse. It is a remarkably bleak portrait, especially from an author known for tales of adventure and romance. But Stevenson understood something that the promotional literature of the sanatoriums tried to obscure. Many patients came to Davos not to be cured, but to die. The mountain air might slow the disease, but it could not always stop it. He wrote about his fellow patients with a mixture of compassion and horror. Young men and women in the prime of life, reduced to counting their heartbeats and measuring their fevers. Some put on brave faces at dinner, discussing their symptoms with the clinical detachment that sanatorium life encouraged. Others withdrew into private despair. And some inevitably died. Stevenson watched them carried away, their rooms quickly cleaned and prepared for the next occupant. The cycle continued without pause. Despite his misery, Stevenson remained productive. Perhaps he wrote to distract himself from his illness. Perhaps the mountain air, however much he despised it, gave him just enough strength to work. In Davos, he completed what would become one of the most beloved adventure novels ever written. Treasure Island had begun as a story told to his stepson Lloyd, accompanied by a hand-drawn map of an imaginary island. Stevenson had started writing it back in Scotland, but the story had stalled. The fog and rain of home seemed to drain the adventure from his imagination. In Davos, during that first brutal winter, he picked it up again. Perhaps it was the contrast. Here he was, trapped in the snow, confined to his room for days at a time, breathing the cold, thin air that was supposed to save him. And on the page he could escape to warm Caribbean waters, to islands where treasure lay buried, where adventure waited around every corner. He wrote the final 14 chapters in 14 days. Long John Silver, Jim Hawkins, the Hispaniola, the Black Spot, all of it flowing from the pen of a sick man, wrapped in blankets in an Alpine hotel, while the snow fell outside and his lungs rattled with each breath. Think of it. One of the most beloved adventure stories ever written, created by a man who could barely walk to the end of his corridor. Tales of sailing ships and sword fights and buried gold, conjured from the imagination of an invalid who spent his days lying on a cure terrace, watching the mountains and waiting for his temperature readings. Lloyd later recalled the excitement of those winter evenings, when Stevenson would read aloud the day's new chapters. The stepson who had inspired the story listened as it came to life, chapter by chapter, in the most unlikely of places. It is one of the strange gifts of Davos. This place of illness and death also became a place of remarkable creativity. Perhaps there was something about the thin air, the isolation, the proximity to mortality, that sharpened the minds of those who came seeking the cure. When death is near, every moment becomes precious. Every word carries weight. Stevenson did not find a cure in Davos. The mountain air, however thin and pure, could not heal whatever was destroying his lungs. He would eventually leave Switzerland, driven out by the very isolation he had come to endure. He travelled to the milder climates of France and England, seeking relief, seeking change, seeking anything that might help. But the disease, or what everyone believed was the disease, followed him. Finally, he made a radical decision. He would travel as far from the cold, the damp, the civilization of Europe as he could possibly go. In 1888, he and his family set sail for the South Pacific. It was an astonishing journey for a man who had been told repeatedly that he was dying. He sailed from island to island, living on boats and in tropical huts, surrounded by peoples whose lives were utterly different from anything he had known in Scotland or Switzerland. He settled eventually in Samoa, on the island of Upolu, where he built an estate called Vailima. The Samoans called him Tusitala, the teller of tales. He wrote prolifically, producing novels and stories and essays until the very end. He died in 1894 at the age of 44, not from lung disease but from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was dictating a letter when he suddenly complained of a pain in his head, asked, "What's that?" and lost consciousness. He died within hours. Modern medical historians have suggested that Stevenson may not have had tuberculosis at all, that his symptoms were more consistent with bronchiectasis or sarcoidosis. But in the 1880s, any persistent lung disease was likely to be diagnosed as consumption. Whether the misdiagnosis saved his life by sending him to the tropics, or whether he would have lived longer had he stayed in Davos, we will never know. What we know is that he spent 2 miserable winters in the Alps, hating every moment of it, writing some of his greatest work to distract himself from his confinement, and then fled to the farthest place on earth. 13 years after Stevenson's departure, another famous British author arrived in Davos. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle, and unlike Stevenson, he had come not for his own health, but for his wife's. Conan Doyle was already famous by then. Sherlock Holmes had made him wealthy and celebrated, even though he sometimes resented the detective who overshadowed his more serious literary work. He was 34 years old, at the height of his creative powers, with a comfortable life in London, and then his wife fell ill. Louisa Hawkins, called Tui by her family, had been diagnosed with tuberculosis. The doctors gave her only months to live. Conan Doyle, trained as a physician before becoming a writer, understood what the diagnosis meant. He had seen patients waste away from consumption. He knew the statistics. Desperate to save her, he learned that the Swiss mountain climate offered hope for consumption patients. Davos was the most famous of the Alpine resorts, the place where the mountain cure had been pioneered, where sanatoriums had been treating patients for 3 decades. And so in 1893, the creator of Sherlock Holmes gathered his wife and their 2 young children and travelled to Davos. They rented a house in the town where Louisa could take the cure while the children played in the snow. They would remain for 4 years. The mountain air did help Louisa. She did not die within months as the doctors had predicted. Whether this was because of the cure, or because the original prognosis had been too pessimistic, or simply because tuberculosis was unpredictable, impossible to say. What matters is that she survived. She survived with periods of relative health and periods of decline. She survived to see her children grow older, to see her husband become ever more famous, to enjoy years that the doctors had told her she would not have. She lived until 1906, 13 years after her diagnosis, dying at last of the disease that had shadowed her for so long. Those 13 years were a gift. The mountain gave them to her, or seemed to. But for Arthur Conan Doyle, those years in Davos were not simply a time of anxious waiting by his wife's bedside. He was, after all, a man of enormous energy and curiosity, a man who had boxed, played cricket, investigated real-life crimes, campaigned for justice. He could not simply sit and wait while his wife rested on the cure terrace. And in Davos he discovered something that would help launch an entirely new industry. He discovered skiing. And in doing so, he would help transform the future of this town far more profoundly than any medical treatment ever could. Conan Doyle was not a man to sit idle. While his wife rested on the cure terraces, he grew restless. The mountains beckoned. The endless snow-covered slopes seemed to demand exploration. He had first encountered skis during a visit to Norway several years earlier. The Norwegians used them for transportation, a practical way to move, through deep snow in the long winter months. He had only observed the sport then, but the image had stayed with him. Now, in Davos, surrounded by snow-covered mountains that rivaled anything in Scandinavia, he realized that the same techniques might work here. He ordered a pair of skis to be sent from Norway, 8-foot Norwegian wooden boards, primitive by modern standards with simple leather bindings that offered little control. These were not the engineered marvels that modern skiers use. They were essentially long planks, shaped at the front to glide over snow. To learn how to use them, he hired local instructors, the Brøndje brothers, Tobias and Johannes. The Brøndje brothers had been skiing in the mountains around Davos for over a year, but they had taken to practicing at night, to avoid the ridicule of the locals who thought the whole enterprise was absurd. Sliding down mountains on wooden planks, it seemed the height of foolishness. The farmers of Davos had lived with these mountains for generations. They knew how to survive the winter without strapping boards to their feet. Conan Doyle did not share this prejudice. To him, the mountains were not obstacles to be endured, but challenges to be conquered. He learned to ski, falling and rising again, until he could navigate the slopes with reasonable confidence. The falls were frequent and sometimes spectacular. Conan Doyle was a large man, powerfully built, and when he lost control on those primitive wooden skis, he went down hard. He later wrote humorously about his many tumbles, The snow packed into every crevice of his clothing, these slow and laborious climbs back up to try again. And then he convinced the Branger brothers to attempt something more ambitious. On the 23rd of March, 1894, at 4:30 in the morning, while most of Davos still slept, Conan Doyle and the two Branger brothers set off from the town. The early start was necessary. They needed to complete the most difficult climbing before the sun softened the snow. They carried their skis on their backs, strapped over their shoulders, as they ascended on snowshoes through the silent pre-dawn darkness. The climb was exhausting. Hours of trudging upward, the altitude making every step harder than the last. Conan Doyle, despite his robust constitution, felt his lungs burning in the thin air. The Branger brothers, more accustomed to the mountains, set the pace. At last they reached the top of the Mayenfelder Furka, a peak 8,000 feet above sea level. The Alps stretched out around them, an endless sea of white peaks catching the morning light. Below, invisible in the valleys, the world went about its business, unaware of the three men standing at the edge of something new. They switched from snowshoes to skis. The bindings were primitive, simple leather straps that held the boot to the ski. There was no modern release mechanism. If you fell badly, your ankle broke before the binding gave way. And then they descended. Down through the snow and ice and thin mountain air, they glided toward the town of Arosa on the other side. The descent was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The long wooden skis gathered speed on the steep slopes. There was no way to brake except by falling deliberately or turning sharply. It was the Mayenfelder Furka crossing, one of the first documented ski descents in Switzerland. Conan Doyle wrote about the experience for the Strand magazine, the same publication that serialized his Sherlock Holmes stories. His article, titled An Alpine Pass on Ski, introduced the English-speaking world to the strange new sport. He described the sensation of gliding over snow, the freedom of movement, the exhilaration of the descent. The time will come, Conan Doyle predicted, when hundreds of Englishmen will come to Switzerland for a skiing season. He vastly underestimated. Today, millions come. The Swiss Alps are one of the great ski destinations of the world, generating billions of dollars annually. The tourism infrastructure that supports this industry, the hotels, the restaurants, the mountain railways, the ski lifts, can trace its origins in part to that dawn crossing in 1894. In Davos, there is a bronze plaque dedicated to Conan Doyle. It honours him as the man who crossed the Mayenfelder Furka from Davos to Arosa on skis, thereby bringing this new sport and the attractions of the Swiss Alps in winter to the world. The plaque does not mention his wife. It does not mention tuberculosis. It does not mention the sanatoriums that brought him to Davos in the first place. It speaks only of sport, of adventure, of the future, not the desperate past that brought him to that moment. It is one of the quieter ironies of history. The man who followed his dying wife to a tuberculosis sanatorium helped invent modern ski tourism. The town that was built for the sick would eventually thrive on the healthy. Conan Doyle could not have known this, of course. When he strapped on those skis and climbed the mountain, he was simply looking for something to do, some way to fill the long hours while his wife rested on the Cure terrace. He was not thinking about the future of alpine tourism. He was thinking about survival, his own and hers. And yet his adventure helped create a future that would outlive the sanatoriums by many decades. The ski resorts that now cover the Alps, the billions of dollars in winter, tourism, the millions of people who come each year to experience the mountains, all of it owes something to that dawn crossing in 1894. The sanatoriums are gone, the patients are forgotten, but the mountains remain, and people still come, not to be cured, but to play. In the spring of 1912, a German novelist named Thomas Mann received troubling news from Davos. His wife Katia had gone to the Alps for treatment of a respiratory condition. The diagnosis was not tuberculosis, or at least not confirmed tuberculosis, but her doctors were concerned enough to recommend the mountain cure. She was staying at the walled sanatorium, the forest sanatorium, which had opened just the year before. The sanatorium was run by Dr. Friedrich Jessen, and it offered the standard cure: rest, mountain air, and rich food. Katia came from an artistic and intellectual family. Her father was a renowned mathematician, her twin brother a physicist. She had given up her own academic pursuits to marry Mann and raise their children. Now she lay on a cure terrace in the Alps, separated from her family, uncertain when she would return. Mann, 47 years old and already a celebrated author, decided to visit his wife. He planned to stay for 3 weeks, just long enough to ensure she was comfortable and to see for himself the famous Davos cure. He had just completed work on a novella called Death in Venice, a dark, atmospheric tale of an aging writer's obsession with beauty and mortality. The story had been difficult to write, emotionally draining. Perhaps he was still thinking about those themes when he boarded the train for Switzerland. The journey itself was significant. Mann travelled from Munich through increasingly dramatic scenery, the train climbing into the Alps, the air growing thinner and clearer. By the time he arrived in Davos, he had already begun to feel the strangeness of the place. What he found in Davos would consume his imagination for the next 12 years. Mann spent his 3 weeks sitting on the balcony beside Katia, breathing the alpine air, watching the strange rituals of sanatorium life. He was a keen observer. His earlier novels had demonstrated his gift for capturing social nuance, and the sanatorium offered a wealth of material. He observed the patients wrapped in blankets on their cure terraces, their faces turned to the sun like flowers following the light. He listened to the polite dinner conversation, discussions of temperature readings and sputum tests conducted with an air of almost absurd normality, as if tracking the progress of a fatal disease were no different from discussing the weather. The dining room fascinated him. Here were people who knew they might be dying, gathered in elegant surroundings, eating rich food, maintaining all the forms of civilized society. They discussed politics and art. They flirted. They formed alliances and rivalries. Death was the elephant in the room that everyone pretended not to see. Or rather, that everyone saw so constantly that they had learned to look through it. Mann would later describe this atmosphere as a mixture of death and amusement. It was the perfect phrase. The sanatorium was both a hospital and a hotel, both a place of desperate medical treatment and a social gathering place for the European upper classes. And then something unexpected happened. Mann developed a cold. He consulted a local doctor, perhaps out of hypochondria, perhaps out of genuine concern, perhaps simply out of curiosity about the diagnostic rituals he had been observing. The doctor examined him and immediately discovered what he called a moist spot on Mann's lung. Would Herr Mann care to stay for 3 months, just as a precaution, to take the cure? Mann was 47 years old, a successful novelist, with a family and obligations waiting in Munich. The suggestion that he might himself become a sanatorium patient, that he might join the ranks of blanket-wrapped figures on the cure terraces, must have been unsettling. He refused. He returned to Munich, leaving his wife behind in the sanatorium, but he carried with him the germ of something more lasting than any respiratory infection. He carried a novel. Mann originally conceived the work as a short, humorous tale, a pendant to Death in Venice, exploring similar themes of time and mortality in a lighter key. Where death in Venice was dark and tragic, the new story would be ironic and observational. He called the sanatorium in his story the Berghof, drawing on his impressions of the real sanatoriums of Davos, particularly the Weld Sanatorium where Katja was being treated, but also the Grand Schatzalp and other establishments he had observed. But the story refused to stay small. As Mann wrote, he found himself drawn deeper and deeper into the world he was creating. The sanatorium became not just a setting, but a symbol, a microcosm of European civilization itself, suspended in the thin air above the ordinary world. Year after year, Mann continued to add to it. What had begun as a novella grew into a sprawling philosophical epic. The First World War interrupted the writing. Mann set aside his sanatorium novel to focus on political essays, grappling with the catastrophe that had engulfed Europe. The world he had known was collapsing, the old certainties were being swept away. When he returned to the Magic Mountain, the novel had taken on new dimensions, time ones. The collapse of the German Empire followed, then the rise of the Weimar Republic, with its fragile democracy and simmering resentments. Through it all, Mann kept returning to his novel of life in an alpine sanatorium, a world that had itself been transformed while he wrote about it. Finally, in November of 1924, 12 years after that 3-week visit to Davos, Der Zauberberg was published, The Magic Mountain. It was nearly 1,000 pages long. The novel tells the story of Hans Castorp, a young engineering student from Hamburg who travels to Davos to visit his cousin Joachim, a patient at the Berghof Sanatorium. Castorp is an ordinary young man, solid, practical, unremarkable, the kind of person who might be expected to become a respectable businessman and live an unremarkable life. He plans to stay for 3 weeks, exactly as long as Mann himself had stayed. But Castorp does not leave after 3 weeks. He develops a slight fever. The doctors discover a moist spot on his lung. He is persuaded to stay, just for a while longer, just until his health improves. The pattern will be familiar to anyone who knows the history of sanatorium treatment. The 3-week visit becomes 3 months. 3 months becomes 6, and slowly, imperceptibly, the patient stops thinking about the flatland below. 7 years pass. 7 years in which Castorp lives in the strange, suspended world of the sanatorium. 7 years of cure terraces and temperature readings, of intellectual debates and romantic entanglements, of watching fellow patients recover or decline or die. 7 years of meals in the elegant dining room, of walks in the mountain air, of endless conversations about ideas that seem to matter enormously in this rarefied atmosphere. Time moves differently in the Berghof. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. The outside world, the flat land, as the sanatorium patients call it, becomes increasingly unreal, like a half-remembered dream. The only reality is the mountain, the cure, the endless present of illness. The patients exist in a kind of bubble, separated from the world below by altitude and by their shared condition. News from the flatland arrives, but it seems distant, irrelevant. What matters is the morning temperature reading. What matters is whether the cough has worsened or improved. The Magic Mountain is not merely a story about tuberculosis. It is a vast philosophical novel, an examination of European culture on the eve of its greatest catastrophe. Mann uses the sanatorium as a microcosm. The patients and staff of the Berghof represent different strands of European thought, gathered together in this isolated setting where ideas can be debated without the distractions of ordinary life. There is the Italian humanist Settembrini, who champions reason and progress, and the Enlightenment values of the French Revolution. He believes in human perfectibility, in the power of education to overcome barbarism, in the inevitable march of civilization toward a brighter future. And there is the Jesuit Nafta, who defends tradition and authority and ultimately violence in service of higher ideals. He believes that the modern world has lost its way, that the liberal faith in progress is an illusion, that only through spiritual renewal, forced if necessary, can humanity be saved. These two men argue endlessly, brilliantly across the pages of the novel. Their debates range over politics and religion, art and science, the nature of time and the meaning of death. Neither can convince the other. Neither can be silenced. Castorp listens to their arguments, never quite committing to either side. He is the new European man, educated, prosperous, uncertain. He finds himself drawn first to one position, then to the other. He cannot choose between the competing visions because he cannot see a way to reconcile them. This is, of course, the condition of Europe itself in the early 20th century. The old certainties were crumbling, new ideologies were rising. The question of what the modern world should believe, what it should value, what it should fight for, had no clear answer. The novel was published in 1924. 10 years later, the Nazis would come to power. Mann, who was of Jewish descent through his wife Katia, would flee Germany and eventually settle in the United States. Looking back, The Magic Mountain seems almost prophetic. The debates that consume the sanatorium patients, nationalism versus internationalism, faith versus reason, civilization versus barbarism, would soon consume all of Europe. The suspended artificial world of the Berghof, where time seems to have stopped, was about to end. History was about to resume with terrible force. The argument between Settembrini and Nafta ends not with agreement but with violence. Unable to resolve their differences through words, they resort to a duel. It is a small-scale preview of what is to come. The novel ends with Castorp finally leaving the mountain, not because he has been cured, but because the First World War has begun. He descends to the flatland to join the fighting. The last we see of him, he's charging into battle singing a German folk song. The song he sings is significant. It is a German folk song about a linden tree, about home and peace and the comfort of rest. He sings it as he runs toward almost certain death, as the shells explode around him, as the world he has known collapses into chaos. Mann does not tell us whether Castorp survives. The question seems almost beside the point. The young man who arrived at the Berghof as a simple engineering student, planning a 3-week visit, has been transformed. 7 years on the mountain have educated him, in ideas, in love, in the proximity of death. Whether he lives or dies in the war, he's no longer the person he was. The world of the sanatorium, thus that strange, timeless, death-haunted world, is over. Whatever comes next, there will be no going back. The suspended reality of the Berghof, where time seemed to have stopped, has been shattered by history. The debates between Settembrini and Nafta have been rendered irrelevant by the guns of August. Or have they? In many ways, the First World War was the bloody resolution of exactly those debates. The clash between nationalism and internationalism, between tradition and progress, between competing visions of what Europe should become. The arguments that seemed so abstract on the Cure terraces of the Berghof were being decided finally and terribly on the battlefields of France and Belgium. The Magic Mountain is both a great novel and a document of historical transition. It captures a world that was about to end. The world of the sanatoriums, yes, but also the world of pre-war Europe, the world of confident assumptions and leisurely intellectual debate. Everything that seemed stable and permanent was about to be swept away. 5 years after The Magic Mountain was published, Thomas Mann received the Nobel Prize in Literature. The novel he had conceived as a short, humorous tale had become one of the landmarks of 20th century fiction. Nearly 1,000 pages long, packed with philosophical debates and medical details and psychological insight, it was everything a popular novel was not supposed to be. And yet it found readers. It found passionate readers, readers who returned to it again and again, who saw in its pages something that spoke to their own experience. And Davos, the real town that had inspired the fictional Berghof, was now famous not only as a health resort but as a literary destination. Visitors came to see the sanatoriums that Mann had described. They walked the paths he had walked. They breathed the same thin mountain air. They looked up at the Schatzalp gleaming on its mountainside and imagined the Berghof. They dined in restaurants that might have served Hans Castorp. They rode the same funicular railway. Literary tourism became part of the Davos economy. The sanatoriums had been closing, but the literary pilgrims kept coming. They wanted to experience what Mann had experienced. They wanted to feel, if only for a moment, what it was like to live in that suspended world, above the ordinary. But the novel's lasting power comes from its treatment of the sanatorium as metaphor. The Berghof is not just a place where sick people go to be cured. It is a world apart, a place where the normal rules of time and society are suspended, where the proximity to death changes everything. Consider how time works in the novel. The first 3 weeks of Castorp's stay are described in immense detail. Every conversation, every meal, every medical examination. Then months pass in a few pages. Years vanish in a sentence. Mann deliberately plays with the reader's sense of duration, making us feel the strange time dilation that sanatorium patients experienced. In the Berghof, time loses its meaning because the patients have stepped outside of history. They are no longer participants in the rush of modern life. They are observers, watchers, people who have been placed on pause while the world continues below. In the sanatorium, small gestures acquire enormous significance. A flush of fever, a glance across the dining room, a cough in the night. Life becomes simultaneously more intense and more absurd. The patients know they may be dying, and yet they continue with their petty rivalries and their elaborate social rituals. Castorp falls in love, obsessively, inappropriately, with a Russian woman named Klavdia Shosha. He barely speaks to her for months. His love is expressed through glances, through the way he positions himself to see her enter the dining room, through the fever that rises whenever she's near. In the ordinary world, this infatuation would seem absurd. In the sanatorium, where every emotion is heightened by mortality, it becomes the central drama of his existence. This is what Mann captured so brilliantly. The strange mixture of death and amusement that he had observed during those 3 weeks in Davos. The way that even in extremity, even in the shadow of mortality, human beings continue to be human. Foolish, vain, hopeful, alive. We do not stop being ourselves when we are faced with death. If anything, we become more intensely ourselves. Our desires sharpen, our fears crystallize, our need for connection, for meaning, for love. All of it becomes more urgent, not less. Davos gave Mann his setting, but his genius was to see in that setting a reflection of something much larger, the condition of modern Europe, suspended between an old world that was dying and a new world struggling to be born. The sanatorium was Europe itself, sick, confused, debating endlessly, unable to choose a path forward. We should not forget, amid the literary and philosophical grandeur of the Magic Mountain, that real people were dying in the sanatoriums of Davos. Not all of them. The mountain cure did help many, patients, extending their lives by years or even decades. But tuberculosis remained a deadly disease, and for many who came to the Alps, the journey was a final one. The death rate varied from sanatorium to sanatorium from year to year. The statistics were carefully kept, though not always honestly reported. A sanatorium with too high a mortality rate would lose its reputation. Patients would choose to go elsewhere. Some establishments developed a macabre practice. When a patient was clearly dying, they would be encouraged to leave, to go home, or to a less prestigious facility. This kept the death statistics low. It also meant that families sometimes received their dying relatives back, transported down from the mountain to expire in the lowlands, their final hours spent not in the alpine air, but in the crowded cities they had travelled so far to escape. The sanatoriums tried to maintain an atmosphere of normality. Patients dined together in elegant restaurants, they attended concerts and lectures, they formed friendships and sometimes romances. But the cure terraces told another story. Row upon row of reclining chairs, each holding a figure wrapped in blankets staring out at the mountains. Some would rise from those chairs and return to the flatland, others would not. There was a particular kind of friendship that formed in the sanatoriums, intense and immediate, born of shared proximity to death. Patients who might never have spoken to each other in ordinary life became intimates. They shared their fears and their hopes. They watched each other's symptoms with the same attention they gave their own. And when one of their number died, they mourned, briefly because there was always another death coming, and because the living had to focus on their own survival. The wealthier sanatoriums offered private rooms and personal nurses, fine wine and rich food. The less exclusive establishments were more Spartan, but still clean and orderly. There was a rough democracy of illness. Tuberculosis killed rich and poor alike, but the accommodations varied enormously. What all shared was the strange rhythm of sanatorium life, the daily temperature readings, the regulated rest periods, the careful monitoring of symptoms. Patients learned to read their own bodies with obsessive precision, tracking the progress of their disease with the same attention a stockbroker might give to market fluctuations. They developed their own vocabulary. A good day meant the fever was down and the cough was manageable. A bad day meant the opposite. The word hemorrhage was spoken in hushed tones. A major hemorrhage often meant the end was near. And always, the mountain was there. The thin air, the intense sunlight, the cold that was supposed to heal. By the early 20th century, Davos had one of the greatest concentrations of sanatoriums in Europe. Hotels, clinics, and private villas dotted the valley, all catering to the same clientele: the sick, the dying, and those who hoped they might be saved. For nearly a century, Davos thrived on tuberculosis. The disease that was killing millions in the lowlands was sustaining an entire economy in the Alps. Doctors, nurses, hoteliers, railway workers, shopkeepers, all depended on the steady stream of patients seeking the cure. It was a strange symbiosis. The bacterium that destroyed lungs also built hotels. The disease that shattered families also created jobs. The death that haunted the cure terraces also filled the cash registers. And then, in the 1940s and 50s, that economy collapsed. The cause was not a change in climate or a shift in fashion. The cause was a group of antibiotics that could actually cure tuberculosis. In 1944 and 45, the antibiotic streptomycin was discovered. It emerged from soil bacteria samples collected in a New Jersey laboratory, an unlikely origin for a medicine that would transform global health. It was the first medicine that could genuinely combat the tuberculosis bacillus, not merely slow the disease, but kill the bacteria that caused it. The initial results were almost miraculous. Patients who'd been given weeks to live recovered. Fevers that had burned for months suddenly broke. Coughs that had rattled through sanatorium halls fell silent. Then came para-aminosalicylic acid, also discovered in 1945. When combined with streptomycin, it greatly reduced the development of drug resistance, a problem that had emerged almost immediately when streptomycin was used alone. And in 1952, isoniazid arrived, inexpensive, well-tolerated, and devastatingly effective. A patient could swallow a pill at home and achieve what months of mountain air had never managed: a genuine cure. The modern era of tuberculosis treatment had begun. For the sanatoriums of Davos, these discoveries were a death sentence. Not for the patients. For the first time, patients could actually be cured, but for the institutions themselves. The logic of the mountain cure had rested on the absence of alternatives. Patients came to Davos because there was nothing else. Rest and fresh air could not cure tuberculosis, but they could sometimes slow its progress, buying time that patients desperately needed. Now there was something better. Pills that could be taken at home. Treatment that did not require years of exile in an alpine valley. In 1956, a study called the Madras experiment confirmed what many already suspected. Researchers in India compared tuberculosis patients treated at home with those treated in sanatoriums. The patients received the same antibiotic medications. The only difference was where they took them. The results were devastating to the sanatorium industry. There was no advantage to institutional care. Patients who stayed at home, taking their pills in familiar surroundings, recovered at the same rate as those who spent months in specialized facilities. The Madras experiment was conducted in India, where the expense of sanatorium care was especially prohibitive. But its implications were universal. If home treatment was equally effective, then why maintain the elaborate infrastructure of sanatoriums? Why send patients away from their families, away from their communities, to lie on cure terraces breathing mountain air that, it now seemed clear, contributed nothing to their recovery? The mountain air had never been the cure. It had only seemed that way because the sanatoriums provided rest and good nutrition and freedom from the crowded, infected environments of the cities. The air was incidental. The isolation was what mattered, and isolation could be achieved anywhere. The sanatoriums had become obsolete. Through the late 1950s and into the 60s, the sanatoriums of Davos began to close. The decline was gradual at first. Fewer new patients arrived. The cure terraces grew less crowded. Some sanatoriums tried to adapt, offering wellness treatments, repositioning themselves as resorts for the stressed rather than hospitals for the sick. But the fundamental logic had changed. Why would anyone travel to the Alps and spend months lying on a cure terrace when they could take a pill at home? The Berghotel Schatzalp, that Art Nouveau masterpiece built by Willem Jan Holzboer, one of the inspirations for Thomas Mann's Berghof, ceased operating as a sanatorium in 1953. It became a resort hotel, catering to healthy tourists instead of dying patients. Other sanatoriums followed. Some were converted to hotels. Some became general hospitals treating conditions that had nothing to do with tuberculosis. Some were simply abandoned, their grand cure terraces empty and silent, their elegant dining rooms echoing with nothing but the mountain wind. The staff dispersed. Doctors who had specialized in tuberculosis had to retrain or retire. Nurses who had spent their careers caring for consumptive patients found themselves without employment. The support industries, the dairies that provided fresh milk, the farms that supplied rich food, the shops that sold warm blankets and books for invalids, lost their customers. By the late 1960s, the sanatorium era was essentially over. By 1972, most specialized tuberculosis treatment facilities across Europe and America had closed. For Davos, the collapse of the sanatorium industry might have been catastrophic. The entire economy had been built around tuberculosis. Hotels, railways, shops, services, all had catered to the needs of the sick and their families. What would happen when the sick no longer came? But Davos had something else. It had the mountains themselves, and it had the infrastructure of us, the railways, the hotels, the international reputation that the sanatorium era had built. The transition from health resort to ski resort was almost seamless. The same trains that had brought tuberculosis patients from the lowlands now brought skiers. The same hotels that had housed the dying now hosted the vigorously healthy. The same mountains that had promised miraculous cures now promised exhilarating recreation. The cure terraces were enclosed and converted to restaurants, serving fondue and glühwein to guests who had no idea that people had once lain dying in those very spaces. The Lehrhallen were dismantled. The temperature charts and sputum samples were replaced by ski passes and trail maps. In a single generation, Davos reinvented itself. The town that tuberculosis had built would survive tuberculosis's defeat. But the transformation was not complete. One more reinvention lay ahead. In 1971, a German economist named Klaus Schwab organised a conference. Schwab was born in 1938 in Ravensburg, Germany, too young to have fought in the war, but old enough to have grown up in its shadow. He had become a professor at the University of Geneva, and he had invited 450 business leaders from across Europe to discuss competing in a global marketplace. He needed a venue, somewhere atmospheric, somewhere memorable, somewhere that would encourage the participants to relax and engage with one another outside the formal sessions. The city hotel would be too sterile, too ordinary. He wanted something that would create a sense of special occasion. He chose Davos. The choice was not random. Davos offered more than just mountain scenery. It offered a connection to culture, to Thomas Mann and the Magic Mountain, to a certain idea of European intellectual life. The sanatoriums might have closed, but the literary and historical associations remained. It offered, in Schwab's words, an opportunity to create a magic meeting place. There was a deliberate echo in that phrase. Mann's novel was about a place set apart from the ordinary world, where the normal rules of time and society were suspended, where people could engage with ideas that seemed impossible to address in the rushed and crowded flatland below. Schwab envisioned something similar, a space where business and political leaders could step back from their daily concerns and think about the larger questions. The conference was a success. Schwab renamed his organisation the European Management Forum. The annual January meeting in Davos became a fixture of the international business calendar. In 1987, the organisation was renamed again, the World Economic Forum. By then, it had evolved from a business conference into something larger, a gathering of political leaders, business executives, academics, and activists, all convening in the small Swiss town to discuss the great issues of the day. The timing was significant. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall would fall in 1989. A new era of global economic integration was beginning. Davos positioned itself as the place where this new world would be discussed, debated, and shaped. In 1981, Time magazine dubbed Davos the magic meeting place, a direct reference to Mann's novel. The phrase stuck. It captured something essential about what Schwab was trying to create. Today, every January, the most powerful people on Earth make their pilgrimage to Davos. Presidents and prime ministers, billionaires and bankers, CEOs and celebrities. They come by helicopter and private jet, their security details swarming the town. They meet in buildings that still bear the architectural signatures of the Sanatorium era: the flat roofs, the large windows, the terraces that once held rows of dying patients. The transformation is complete. The town that was built for death now hosts the masters of the global economy. The buildings designed to cure tuberculosis now incubate deals that shape the world. The sanatoriums are gone, but their influence remains, not just in Davos, but in the very foundations of modern architecture. The architects who designed the tuberculosis sanatoriums were solving a specific medical problem: how to maximize patients' exposure to light and air. But in solving that problem, they developed forms and techniques that would revolutionize building design. Consider the challenges they faced. Traditional buildings of the 19th century were designed to protect against the elements. Thick walls, small windows, steeply pitched roofs. They were fortresses against the weather. But for tuberculosis patients, this protection was precisely the problem. What they needed was exposure, not shelter. And so the sanatorium architects invented a new kind of building: the flat roof, the Davoser Flachdach, which allowed for rooftop terraces where patients could recline in the sun. The roof was slightly angled toward the centre, with internal gutters to drain snowmelt, solving the practical problem of alpine weather while creating new space for therapeutic use. The large windows that flooded interiors with light, not decorative flourishes, but medical necessities. Sunlight was believed to have germicidal properties, and even if this belief was overstated, the psychological benefit of bright, airy spaces was real. The balconies and verandas that brought the outdoors in, the cure terraces that became the signature feature of every sanatorium, the long galleries where patients could walk in fresh air even during inclement weather. The clean, unornamented lines that emphasized function over decoration. Why add ornament to a building when every service should serve the purpose of healing? The stripped-down aesthetic of the sanatoriums anticipated the minimalism of 20th century modernism. These elements would become the hallmarks of modernist architecture. Le Corbusier, one of the founders of modern architecture, had a direct association with the Davos flat roof experiments of the 1870s and 80s. His famous 5 points of architecture, pilatus, free facade, open floor plan, ribbon windows and roof garden, all find their antecedents in sanatorium design. Modern architecture, one critic noted, has more to do with a campaign for health than with anything else. It was not an exaggeration. The sanatorium was in many ways the laboratory of modern architecture. The demands of tuberculosis treatment, light, air, exposure to the sun, pushed architects to develop new forms that would come to define the built environment of the 20th century. The first reinforced concrete building in Switzerland was a tuberculosis sanatorium. The material allowed for large spans and open interiors that traditional construction could not achieve. The structural innovations driven by medical necessity would transform how buildings were made. Walk through any modern city, and you are walking through the legacy of the tuberculosis sanatoriums. The glass-walled office towers, the apartment buildings with their balconies, the hospitals with their patient rooms flooded with natural light, the schools designed to maximize fresh air circulation. All of it traces back, in one way or another, to the experiments conducted in places like Davos, places where architects were trying to save lives by letting in the sun. The disease is largely conquered, at least in the wealthy nations where these architectural forms first emerged, but the buildings remain, and every time we step onto a rooftop terrace or bask in the light of a floor-to-ceiling window, we are, in a sense, taking the cure. Let us pause now and consider what we have witnessed tonight. We have travelled to a small valley in the Swiss Alps, a place that has been many things over the past 2 centuries. A farming village, isolated and unknown, a health resort, famous throughout Europe, a literary landmark immortalised in one of the great novels of the 20th century, a ski destination, drawing millions of visitors each winter, a gathering place for the global elite, where the future of the world economy is debated. Through all of these transformations, one thing has remained constant: the mountain itself. The air is still thin in Davos. At 1,500 metres above sea level, every breath contains less oxygen than in the lowlands. The effect is subtle. Visitors barely notice it, but it is real. The body must work slightly harder, the heart beats slightly faster, there is a faint lightheadedness, especially in the first few days. The sunlight is still intense. At this altitude, with the clear mountain air filtering less of the ultraviolet radiation, the sun feels stronger than it should for such northern latitudes. Skiers burn on winter days. The brightness after a snowfall can be almost painful. The winters are still long. The snow still falls on rooftops that were designed to melt it through internal gutters, that ingenious Davos flat roof that helped birth modern architecture. The cold still bites. The nights still come early. The geography that Dr. Alexander Spengler noticed in 1853, that strange, healthy geography where tuberculosis seemed unable to take hold, has not changed. What has changed is human understanding. In Spengler's time, no one knew what caused tuberculosis. The germ theory of disease was still decades away. Doctors could only observe patterns and hope to find correlations. Spengler observed that the villagers of Davos did not get tuberculosis, and he concluded that something about the mountain, the altitude, the air, the sunshine, must be responsible. He was not entirely wrong. The dry alpine air may indeed have slowed the spread of the disease. The intense sunlight, rich in ultraviolet radiation, may have killed bacteria in the environment. The isolation of the sanatoriums may have reduced transmission. But he was not entirely right either. The mountain could not cure tuberculosis. It could only, at best, slow its progress. The patients who came to Davos seeking a cure were often disappointed. Many died far from home, in beautiful rooms with magnificent views, their lungs failing despite all the fresh air and rich food. The true cure came not from geography, but from science. From researchers in laboratories who identified the tuberculosis bacillus and eventually developed the antibiotics that could kill it. And yet we should not be too quick to dismiss the sanatorium era as mere superstition. The sanatoriums of Davos offered something that mattered deeply to their patients: hope. In an age when tuberculosis was a death sentence, when doctors had nothing to offer but resignation, the sanatoriums promised action. Come to the mountain, take the cure, fight the disease. The alternative was simply to wait for death, to cough and waste and fade, surrounded by family members who could do nothing but watch, to measure out your remaining days in a sick room, knowing that each sunset might be your last. The sanatoriums offered something different. They offered a journey. The trip to the Alps was itself a kind of pilgrimage, a transition from the ordinary world into a special place where different rules applied. They offered a regimen. The cure terraces, the temperature readings, the prescribed rest periods gave patients something to do, a routine to follow, a sense that they were taking action against their disease. And they offered community. In the sanatoriums, patients were surrounded by others who understood their situation. They did not have to explain their symptoms or justify their fears. Everyone knew. Everyone was fighting the same battle. This hope was not always realistic. Many patients died. The mountain could not cure tuberculosis, only, at best, slow its progress. But some survived, and their survival was attributed to the mountain cure. Word spread. More patients came, the industry grew. We might call this exploitation, profiting from the desperation of the dying, and there was undoubtedly an element of that in the sanatorium business. The wealthy could afford the best facilities, the poor were left to die in tenement apartments. The sanatorium owners grew rich while their patients often did not survive. But we might also call it human resilience. In the face of a disease they did not understand and could not cure, doctors and patients refused to surrender. They built institutions, they developed rituals, they created communities where the sick could support one another. The sanatorium was not just a medical facility, it was a social structure, a way of organising the experience of illness, of giving shape and meaning to what would otherwise be mere suffering. Consider what it meant to be diagnosed with tuberculosis in the 19th century. There was no treatment, there was no cure. You might live for years, or you might die within months. All you could do was wait and wonder and slowly decline. The sanatorium transformed this experience. Instead of passive waiting, there was active treatment. Instead of isolation, there was community. Instead of meaningless suffering, there was a narrative, the journey to the mountain, the taking of the cure, the hope of recovery. Even if the treatment did not work, and often it did not, the experience itself had value. Patients felt they were doing something, they felt they were fighting. And when the end came, it came in a place of beauty, among people who understood, rather than in a cramped and smoky city flat. Thomas Mann understood this. His Magic Mountain is not primarily a story about medicine. It is a story about how human beings create worlds, how even in the shadow of death we build societies, debate ideas, fall in love, pursue petty rivalries, and insist on living. There is something deeply human about the pilgrimage to Davos, both in the sanatorium era and today. The tuberculosis patients who travelled to the Alps in the 19th and early 20th centuries were seeking something beyond mere survival. They were seeking transformation. The journey itself was part of the cure. The long train ride, the climb into the mountains, the passage from the crowded, diseased lowlands into the clean, thin air above. Think of what that journey meant. You left behind your ordinary life, your home, your work, your friends. You said goodbye to family members who knew they might never see you again. You boarded a train that would carry you across borders, through landscapes increasingly dramatic, until at last you arrived at a place unlike anywhere you had been before. The altitude changed you, the air changed you, the removal from everyday concerns changed you. Whatever happened next, whether you recovered or declined, you were no longer the person you'd been in the flatland. Today's pilgrims to Davos are not sick in body, but they come seeking something similar, a chance to step outside their normal lives, to ascend to a special place where different rules apply, to engage with others in an atmosphere of heightened significance. The World Economic Forum is, in its way, a kind of secular sanatorium. The participants retreat from the flatland, from the ordinary world of business and politics, to spend a few days in an elevated environment where they can focus on the big questions. Like the tuberculosis patients of the past, they wrap themselves in rituals, they attend sessions, they network, they are seen at the right parties, they line up for photographs and exchange business cards and participate in panel discussions. The content of the discussions matters, but so does the fact of being there, of having made the pilgrimage to the mountain. To attend Davos is to signal membership in a certain club, to demonstrate that you matter enough to be invited, to participate in a ritual that validates your importance. This is not meant as criticism. Human beings have always made pilgrimages. We have always been drawn to places that seem to offer something beyond the ordinary. Healing, insight, transformation. The medieval pilgrims who walked to Santiago de Compostela, the Hindu devotees who bathe in the Ganges, the millions who visit Mecca each year, all are responding to the same deep human need. The form changes, the impulse remains. We climb mountains, literal and metaphorical, because we believe that something awaits us at the top. If we listen carefully, we can still hear the ghosts of Davos. They are everywhere, these ghosts. In the architecture itself, the cure terraces converted to restaurants, the flat roofs now holding solar panels instead of reclining invalids. In the streets that were laid out to accommodate horse-drawn carriages carrying the sick. In the railway that still climbs the same route it travelled in 1890, when the first train brought new hope to a valley of the dying. The coughing patients on the cure terraces, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun set over the mountains. They came from across Europe, from Germany and England, from Russia and France, from Austria and the Netherlands. They spoke different languages, held different beliefs, came from different social classes. But they were united by their illness, by their hope, by their presence on that mountain. The nurses in their starched white uniforms making their rounds, taking temperatures, recording symptoms, offering what comfort they could to those who were slowly slipping away, rejoicing quietly when a patient showed improvement, preparing grimly when the end was near. The doctors with their stethoscopes and their hopeful theories about altitude and air. They were trying their best, these men. They did not know about bacteria or antibiotics or immune systems. They only knew that some patients who came to the mountain improved, and that was more than could be said for any other treatment available. Robert Louis Stevenson, miserable in the Hotel Belvedere, writing Treasure Island to distract himself from his fears, creating adventure because he could not have it, conjuring warm seas and buried gold while the snow fell outside his window and his lungs ached with every breath. Arthur Conan Doyle, strapping on his 8-foot Norwegian skis, determined to find some adventure in this place of illness and death. His wife lay dying, slowly, on a cure terrace, and he could not simply wait. He had to do something. He had to move. He had to climb the mountain and race down the other side, if only to prove that he was still alive. Thomas Mann, sitting on a balcony beside his wife, observing the mixture of death and amusement that would inspire his greatest novel. Taking notes perhaps, watching, storing up impressions that would take 12 years to fully process. The patients of the Berghof, or rather, the real patients of the real sanatoriums, debating philosophy and falling in love and measuring their fevers, all while the disease slowly consumed them. They did not know they were characters in a novel not yet written. They only knew that they were alive for now, and that the mountain was beautiful, and that tomorrow they might learn their fever had broken, or that it had not. Dr. Alexander Spengler, arriving as a refugee with nothing but his medical training, noticing the one fact that would transform this valley forever. The villagers do not get tuberculosis. A simple observation, a question that demanded an answer, a theory that would build an empire. Willem Jan Holspoor, grieving his dead wife, deciding to stay anyway, seeing opportunity where others saw only mountains. He could have returned to the Netherlands. He could have resumed his ordinary life. Instead, he stayed in the valley where his wife had died, and he built something that would outlast them both. Carl Spengler, donating his trophy, hoping that sport could reunite nations that war had divided. He had seen what hatred could do. He believed that competition, fair and friendly, might heal some of the wounds. 100 years later, the tournament he founded still runs. All of them are gone now. The patients, the doctors, the nurses, the visionaries, the writers, they lie in graveyards across Europe, or their ashes have scattered on the wind. But the town they built remains, The railway still runs, the hotels still stand, the flat roofs still catch the alpine sun. What does Davos teach us about the history of tuberculosis? Perhaps this: that human beings, faced with forces beyond their control, will find ways to respond. We build institutions, we develop theories, we create hope, even when hope is irrational. The sanatorium movement was, in many ways, a vast exercise in collective wishful thinking. The mountain could not cure tuberculosis, but the belief that it could, the organisation of resources and rituals around that belief, gave structure to the experience of illness and sometimes extended lives. We might smile condescendingly at the naive faith of 19th century doctors in mountain air. They believed so earnestly in their cure. They built entire industries around it. They wrote papers and gave lectures and trained generations of physicians in the practice of altitude therapy. But we should also recognise that they were doing their best with the knowledge they had. They did not have microscopes powerful enough to see the tuberculosis bacillus until Robert Koch's discovery in 1882. They did not have any effective medication. They only had observation and inference and hope. And we should ask ourselves, what are we believing today that will seem equally naive to future generations? Every era has its blind spots. Every generation is certain of things that later generations will discover to be wrong. The physicians of Davos were wrong about the curative power of mountain air, or at least they were wrong about how and why it worked, but they were trying. They were responding to a crisis with the tools they had. Medicine advances, understanding deepens. What seemed like wisdom becomes superstition. What seemed impossible becomes routine. The antibiotics that destroyed the sanatorium industry would have seemed like magic to Dr. Spengler. He would not have believed that a simple pill could accomplish what his elaborate alpine cure could not. And yet some things do not change. The human desire for healing, the search for special places that promise transformation, the impulse to ascend, literally and metaphorically, above the ordinary. We still believe in the healing power of nature. We still retreat to mountains and beaches when we are stressed or ill. We still feel that something about elevated places, the thin air, the spectacular views, the removal from everyday concerns, can heal us in ways that city life cannot. Perhaps this belief is not entirely wrong. Perhaps the sanatorium doctors, for all their mistakes about bacteria and lungs, understood something true about human beings, that we are creatures of environment, that place matters, that the context of our lives shapes our health in ways that pure medicine cannot address. Davos endures because it answers that impulse. The specific content changes: tuberculosis cure, ski resort, global economic summit, but the underlying pattern remains. Humans climb the mountain, they seek what lies above. And sometimes they find it. The mountain waits. It has been waiting for millions of years. It will wait for millions more. The humans who climb its slopes, seeking cures, seeking adventure, seeking power, are brief visitors, passing through on their way to somewhere else. The mountain does not judge them. The mountain does not heal them. The mountain simply endures. But for those brief visitors, the experience of the mountain can be transformative. Whether they come as tuberculosis patients or as skiers or as participants in the World Economic Forum, they all share something. The sense of having stepped outside ordinary life, of having ascended to a place where different rules apply. That is the gift of Davos. That is what Dr. Spengler discovered. Even if he understood it imperfectly, the mountain offers a kind of perspective that the flatland cannot provide. From those heights, the problems of ordinary life seem smaller, the air is clearer, the view extends to the horizon. The sanatoriums understood this. The ski resorts understand this. The World Economic Forum understands this. They have all, in their different ways, capitalized on the human need to climb, to rise, to see from above. Tuberculosis brought people to Davos, but something more than tuberculosis kept them coming back. Let us return one final time to that moment in 1853. A young doctor arrives in a remote alpine village. He's a refugee, a man who has lost his country and his profession, and nearly everything he once thought certain. The political upheaval that swept through Germany has cast him out, and he is washed up in this high valley like driftwood on a distant shore. He carries only his medical training, and whatever hope remains. He does not know that he's about to change the world. He only knows that he needs work, and that this village needs a doctor. He looks around at the villagers, healthy, ruddy-faced farmers who work the harsh alpine land. Their lives are difficult. They struggle against the mountains, against the weather, against the isolation, but they are alive. They are strong. He thinks of the cities he's left behind, where 1 in 7 deaths is caused by tuberculosis, where families are wiped out generation after generation by a disease no one understands. He remembers patients he could not save. He remembers the coughing and the blood and the slow, terrible wasting. And he notices something. These villagers do not get tuberculosis. Why? It is such a simple question. Why are these people healthy when so many others are sick? What is different about this place? That question, asked in ignorance, would transform a village into a city. It would draw the sick and the famous and the powerful from across the world. It would inspire one of the great novels of the 20th century. It would leave its mark on the very shape of modern buildings. It would create a railway and a hockey tournament and a global economic summit. All from one question. All from one observation, all from one man's refusal to simply accept that tuberculosis was everywhere, inevitable, unstoppable. The answer Dr. Spengler arrived at was incomplete. The mountain could not truly cure tuberculosis. The air, however thin and pure, could not kill the bacteria that were destroying his patients' lungs. But the question itself, the simple, stubborn human refusal to accept death without a fight, that was the real achievement. That impulse to ask why, to notice patterns, to seek explanations, to try something new, that is what built Davos. That is what built modern medicine. That is what continues to drive human progress against disease. And so, as the night deepens and the alpine wind fades into memory, we leave Davos behind for now. But its legacy remains. In the architecture of our hospitals, with their large windows and their balconies, and their flood of natural light. In the shape of our cities, with their flat-roofed buildings and their modernist aesthetic. In the very idea that geography might heal, that where we are matters as much as what we take. The sanatoriums are closed, the patients are long dead, but something of what they built endures. The Rhaetian Railway still climbs into the mountains, following the same route that Willem Jan Holsboer laid out more than a century ago. Tourists take it without thinking about its origins, about the sick and dying people whose need to reach the mountain cure justified the enormous expense of construction. The Schatzalp still stands, now a hotel instead of a sanatorium, but the building is the same. The Art Nouveau details, the grand public spaces, the views that once consoled the dying, all remain. Guests sleep in rooms where patients once measured their fevers and waited to learn whether they would live or die. The flat roofs still catch the alpine sun. The cure terraces, now enclosed and converted to restaurants and bars, still face the same magnificent view that patients once contemplated as they fought for their lives. The architecture remains, even as the purpose it was designed to serve has vanished. And every January, when the world's most powerful people gather in Davos to discuss the future, they walk streets that were laid out for the dying. They meet in buildings that were designed to heal. They breathe the same thin air that was once considered miraculous. They probably do not think about the ghosts. They probably do not imagine the cure terraces, the temperature readings, the slow parade of patients who came seeking life and sometimes found death instead. They are focused on the future, not the past. But the past is there, encoded in every building, in every street, in the very shape of the town. Davos was built by tuberculosis. Without the disease, it would still be a farming village, unknown to the world. Everything that makes it what it is today, the hotels, the railway, the international reputation, can be traced back to Dr. Spengler's observation in 1853. The mountain does not care about human purposes. It simply is. It was there before Dr. Spengler arrived, and it will be there long after the World Economic Forum has ended. The peaks will catch the sun, the snow will fall, the air will remain thin and cold and clear. What changes is human understanding. What changes is human need. What changes is what we seek when we climb. Next time on the Sanatorium, we'll travel westward to the American frontier, where an entire city would be built on the promise of the climate cure. Denver, Colorado, the world's largest tuberculosis camp, a city where 1/3 of the population, at the height of the Sanatorium era, had come seeking the cure. A city that would transform itself just as Davos did when antibiotics made the climate cure obsolete. But that journey is for another night. For now, rest well. Let the distant memory of alpine wind carry you gently into sleep. Let the thin air of the mountain fill your imagination. The peaks stand patient and eternal, their snow-covered summits catching the last light of stars. Somewhere, in the buildings that remain, the ghosts of Davos still rest on their cure terraces. They watch the sun set over the mountains, they measure their temperatures, they hope. If you found some measure of peace in tonight's journey, perhaps leave a like, or share it with someone who might need it. If you're new to the Sanatorium, consider subscribing. There are many more stories to tell, many more places where tuberculosis left its mark on our world. The mountain will be here when you return. Thank you for being here. Good night.